The next thing that I wanted to talk about is, frankly, what Indiana has done. Indiana has proven to be the most unlikely or likely college football playoff team, depending on how you want to look at it. But they are even more unlikely than BYU for me. BYU has won a national championship. BYU has a Heisman winner. BYU won 11 games just 4 years ago in 2020. Indiana ain't done none of that. They ain't never been there, right? They're 9-0 for the first time in history, which means if they win 10 games, 10th game coming against a Michigan team that traditionally whoops their behind, they get to 10 wins for the first time in school history, and they'll be 10-0. That's remarkable. They're as good offensively as they are defensively. The problem that you run into is that they haven't played anybody with a ranking next to their name, and that is really going to be defining their season up until they get to Ohio State. You beat the snot out of Nebraska that pushed Ohio State into the deep water. That looks good for you. You beat the snot out of Michigan State 47-10. Well, that's a program that Ohio State beat 38-7, and a program that not Ohio State, Oregon beat 31-10, and you won by 37, right? That's a ridiculous margin. You got Curtis Rourke back, who we think affects winning for you, but Taven Jackson looked good, and your defense is playing lights out, and Kurt Cignetti knows how to win. I think as we're looking at the Hoosier Daddies being 9-0 and getting into the ranking for the first time since 2020, they've also achieved their highest ever ranking in the college football playoff era in its initial ranking in week 11, where they're at number 8. They've never been higher than number 11, which is really remarkable. But you take into account what they have done to people, and it ain't been close. This is why I compare them to Clemson in 2015 or 2018. They won every game they played by 14 points or more. They have beaten Big Ten teams by scores of 29, 37, and 49 points. That's the difference, right? They have 2 of those 3 wins on the road. Like, they went down to UCLA and handed them their head. Same UCLA that beat up on Nebraska, right? Same Nebraska, they stomped a mud hole in and walked it dry. So they're exactly where they were in the AP ranking. I have them at number 6. I'm higher on Indiana than some, but I'm willing to go with this because we got college football left to play. They're also the 3rd best team in the Big Ten. That might have a lot to do with how they get in, where they get in, because you know that 1 and 2, Oregon and Ohio State, can't stay there if they play in a Big Ten championship, because one of those is probably going to fall to that 5 spot, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. But barring a disastrous loss for IU or Ohio State for that matter, that matchup will define what this program or what these programs are going to do on December 4th. If Ohio State beats Indiana, and Indiana's got the 1 loss, but they're 11-1, do you put them in there ahead of a Penn State? Do you put them in there ahead of a Tennessee? Do you put them in there ahead of a Alabama, a Notre Dame? It's an interesting discussion because Notre Dame's loss is bad. It's to Northern Illinois, right? They've also beaten some really great teams. Alabama's got 2 losses, right? You've got the one to Vanderbilt, and they're not in your college football playoff selection committee top 25. Hello? Like, I don't know how you leave Vanderbilt out of this thing, but that doesn't help Alabama in the least. And then you got the loss to Tennessee, and Tennessee is clinging to the loss to Arkansas, among other things. And then say nothing of Ole Miss is playing for its life like LSU and Alabama for the rest of, well, at least through this weekend, right? You got to beat Georgia, which is a tall task. If they beat Georgia, it's really hard to put a 3-loss Georgia into the college football playoff, and that will really upset these rankings. And then we'll have some real math to do. But that's getting a little bit ahead of it. I'm still focused on Indiana get past Michigan because on the one hand, you know that you ought to beat them like they stole something. You should walk them down. On the other hand, you're 10 and 58 against them. They have whooped you way more times than you have whooped them. And either you're going to ignore that maize and blue and come out there and be IU, or you're not. And I think that's psychological. And we'll get an answer to that very quickly. I think that this team is built to make a run toward the college football playoff, and I would be shocked if they're not in it, regardless of what Penn State does, regardless of what Notre Dame does, regardless of what Alabama does. I think that IU will be there at the end in the college football playoff, and that's really fun for all of us, quite frankly. The third thing I wanted to make a mention of, well, let me stick with this for just a second. Let me walk this out just a little bit further. If you're Oregon, you have no excuse. You need to win every game you play all the way through. I don't care that Tez Johnson is not there. If you're Ohio State, you have no excuse. You're going to play the worst team in the Big Ten this weekend at Purdue. As a matter of fact, if the starters are not out after the first series of the third quarter, I'm going to say this select committee, this group of suits in a boardroom in Grapevine, Texas, at a resort is going to find a reason to say that Ohio State's not that good. But they know what the roster is, and they know how much was spent on the roster, and they love a good roster. We know this because they took it out on Florida State when they lost Jordan Travis. So at the top, there's really not room for error here, because if Ohio State takes a loss to Indiana, I don't see them getting into the college football playoff. By this measure, I think I would still have them one of the 12 best teams in the sport, but I'm not sure that the selection committee would. I don't know that they would give them the benefit of the doubt. I know that they've been giving it to some, but it doesn't feel like they're going to give it to them because the schedule just hasn't panned out for them. That said, they got to win against a team that they rank at number 6 in Penn State on the road, so that might be enough. So could you see 4 teams from the Big Ten get into this thing? It's possible, right? If Penn State wins out, Indiana and Ohio State will do what they do, but they get to, let's say Ohio State's 11-1. Let's say Penn State's 11-1. If Ohio State makes the Big Ten championship, I don't know how you're going to leave them out. Oregon, they lose the Big Ten championship. I don't know how you're going to leave them out. So we could see 4 teams from the Big Ten into the college football playoff, and I don't think that would shock anybody. No, Soldier, this is not pre-recorded. It's live. I don't live pre-recorded. Like that's garbage. No, if I'm doing it, I'm doing it. But bear that in mind as we continue to go through this thing, because I'm looking at the SEC, whose highest ranked team, by the way, is Georgia at number 3, then Texas at 5, then Tennessee at 7, and then Alabama at 11. So that's only 3 teams in the top 10 for the SEC, whereas, we got 4 from the Big Ten in here. I've always thought that the selection committee would go into this thing believing that the SEC is the deeper league, is the better league, and it doesn't seem like they feel that way. They feel that the Big Ten is the deeper league, is the better league. That helps Indiana, and it hurts Alabama. Like, Alabama takes a loss against LSU, it's over. It's just over. If LSU gets a win, I'm not necessarily sure that they're going to stay in this thing, but they do have a road to the SEC championship, and that's going to help them. They went out, they're getting in, right? I think the one that kind of caught me off guard there was Georgia being at 3. I thought they would have them at 2, with the win on the road to Texas meaning a lot more than perhaps the win for Ohio State against Penn State, because I think we all believe that Penn State is not as good as Texas. And so do they, right? Texas at number 5, Penn State at number 6. I think it's just the distance from that, because they watched Ohio State beat Penn State last week, and it's been a couple of weeks since we last saw Texas get a beating from Georgia at home at night. I think that part I would have flipped, right? I don't know. I think that the win on the road for Georgia was really demonstrative from the standpoint of their defense. If that defense that we saw against Texas shows up to play in the college football playoff, it's over. Like, that defense is amazing. I'm not sure that Ohio State or Oregon has something that can stop it. That said, I would love to see that game. I think that game would be outstanding, and I'm here to be wrong about that. That would be great. The third thing I wanted to point out here is that the number 5 seed continues to be the best seed at the college football playoff table. And right now, that's Texas. I would want the number 5 seed before I want any other seed in college football. And I've been loud about this from the very beginning. So when you hear other folks say it, you can take it back to September, man. I've been saying for some time, I want to be number 5. This is the first year of the college football playoff, which is important because it means that as the number 5 seed, you get the opportunity to host the first home game in postseason history, period. And it's against the number 12 team, which in this case is Boise State. So at this point, we're talking about a 5 seed getting the 12 seed that is Boise State, right? So Boise State goes to Texas. Good grief, man. Do you expect Boise State to win that game? I don't. I don't care how good or bad you think Quinn Ewers is. Ashton Jeanty has not looked like the guy in the second half that he did in the first half. He rushed for 1,200 yards. In the first half of the season, the next 2 games, he hasn't busted more than 150. He just ain't been that guy. He's going to need a couple of 300-yard games, 400-yard games if he wants to pass Barry Sanders for the most rushing yards in a single season with 26-28. I don't think he's going to do it, but he's got an opportunity to do that. Even so, does Boise State look like the kind of football team that could beat Texas? No. So if Texas wins that game, they get the weakest of the highest-ranked conference champions, which in this case would be BYU. So you play BYU on a neutral site And I think many of us are going to pick Texas in that game too. So you get that game, and then you get to play the number one team in the country, which at this point is Oregon, but you would get Oregon after they've already had to play a game. So there's that bye week that they get back is now gone, because we don't talk about bye weeks coming weeks later. We talk about the following week. So then you get Texas versus Oregon in a college football playoff semifinal, and you're one win away from playing in the national championship game. So I would love to see in the future either the seeding change up based on the rankings, or that if you're the 1 seed, you get the opportunity to choose. You get to be the number 1 seed and take the week off and get the 8-9 seed, or you get to be the 5 seed and you play the 12 seed right away, but you play 12 seed at home, because I think people are really undervaluing the magnitude of what it's going to mean to get that home game. You think about playing on the road in the SEC, playing on the road in the Big Ten. Imagine that in a postseason environment. You're stuck, dude. Like that is as hostile as it's gonna be, and you're gonna have the wind at your back like you've never had it before if you are the 5 seed. Thinking about what A&M was able to pull off against LSU, right? Thinking about Arkansas was able to pull off against Tennessee. Thinking about Vanderbilt, what they were able to pull off against Alabama. Multiply that by 10, and I think that is what you're going to be looking at when you are talking about this really, really great atmosphere of the 5-12 matchup. And I don't envy the 12 seed here. Could it be someone other than Boise State? Yeah, I think Army's got an opportunity to do that. They're undefeated. They get Bryson Daly back. They'll probably be pretty good. But at number 25, that's a tough sell, right, all the way up. To say nothing of what you think of the American Conference, which doesn't look as good as it did with Memphis taking a loss last week. Meanwhile, Southern Methodist is one of those teams that we're not sure what to do with. And the way that the ACC is breaking out, they might not make this thing, as they and A&M are the first 2 teams out of the college football playoff. A&M did it to itself. They were number 1 in the SEC when we're talking about having an opportunity to play in that conference championship. Now we got 5 teams that are tied in the SEC play with 1 loss apiece. If they didn't lose to South Carolina, they wouldn't be one of those teams. They'd be in the top 10, and they'd probably be in the top 5 according to where this committee wants to rank them. But I think the loss to Notre Dame is helpful to them, because Notre Dame has been on a rampage, though Notre Dame also lost to Northern Illinois. And they're looking at being the 10 seed, which I like, which means they got to go on the road. And I like them having to go on the road to play a team that, frankly, they wouldn't want to play anywhere other than an NFL stadium. Because that's the thing about Notre Dame. When they play on the road, it's not always that they play at someone else's facility. Sometimes they play at MetLife. Sometimes they play at Soldier Field. It just depends on what that game is going to look like, because they're independents. They're not ACC members, which is why we have a 17-team league and not an 18-team league. Got this open marriage going. Catholic school got an open marriage going with the ACC. I've always thought that was funny, and I'm going to continue to think it's funny. But I continue to tell you that being the number 5 seed is the best spot. If you can somehow engineer a way to play as the 5 seed, you should. You should. You want the home game before you want the neutral site game, because the neutral site game is already a place that's far away from your campus. I don't give a damn that it's closer to your campus than the other teams. You want to have that game at your house. You want to have that game at DKR if you're Texas. You want to have that game at Bryant-Denny if you're Alabama. You want to have that game at the Shoe if you're Ohio State. And that's why I think Oregon and Ohio State are in a spot to where they could end up with that 5 seed. So if both of them continue to run the table, let's say Ohio State beats Indiana and Oregon's undefeated, we know that based on what this committee has put down today, that the loser of that game gets the 5 seed. You want to win the Big Ten championship. Everybody wants to win the Big Ten championship, but it's not as if that consolation prize is terrible. That consolation prize is probably the 5 seed, unless you get beat down. If it's a 1-score game or a 2-score game, you probably get the 5 seed. If not, maybe somebody else can slide up into that. Maybe it is the runner-up in the SEC championship, depending on what we think about that team. If it ends up being, say, Georgia and Texas again, I think that's a possibility, right? Especially if Texas is able to win that game. Would you want to keep Georgia in the college football playoff if they take that loss? I think so. I think you're looking at that. I continue to say that these things are going to move. We know that they're going to move. We know that as teams got to play each other, like LSU and Bama, 2 teams that right now would be making the college football playoff barely by winning against each other, you're going to get there. But SMU at 13, Texas A&M at 15, Bama at 11, you just can't afford any slip-ups. That's just not going to happen. Whereas BYU takes an unnecessary loss, I don't think they're going to get in there either, but that also opens the door for a team like Colorado. So there's a lot to prove here. But this is our time, man. November is going to be so much fun.